Cool. Okay, hi, my name's Christopher Yeoh. I work for IBM for the Linux Technology Centre. I'm going to be talking today about the Nova v3 API. Who here has kind of used the Nova REST API directly? Okay, so a few people kind of familiar with it. So currently we've got the v2 API in Grizzly. During the Grizzly release or the development cycle, did some work looking at the REST API to see what kind of state it was in, to fix a few problems with it. But we ran into quite a few issues where, although we knew something was wrong, we couldn't change it because of backwards compatibility issues. So it was decided during the Havana Development Summit that we'd actually do a v3 release of the API with the plan of eventually throwing away v2, kind of starting afresh and putting things how we think they should be. So the current v2 API is a REST interface. We support both XML and JSON. JSON is probably by far the most well-tested and I think the most used interface out there. In fact, there's been some discussions on the mailing list recently about whether or not we can drop the XML interface. The reason being that supporting two interfaces at a time is actually quite a bit of overhead. It basically doubles the amount of testing we have to do, and also introduces a few points where we can get inconsistencies between the two. We haven't been able to get any consensus on that, unfortunately, so it looks like for v3 we will release with both XML and JSON, but there may be some kind of ongoing issues about that. Just to get a kind of feeling here, who here would actually need an XML REST API in addition to JSON? Is there anybody who's in that kind of situation? No. Yeah, people say enterprise, but I'd like to see some real people out there who just really do need it. So an example kind of here of how you access the interface. This is for the v2 interface. If you want to get a list of extensions out of Nova that are currently installed, you get an authentication token from Keystone, you pass it through to Nova. The bit after the v2 over here is basically a tenant ID, identifies which tenant you want to get the information for extensions, and it basically returns a big JSON formatted thing of all the extensions which are currently installed in Nova. Now the core of the Nova v2 API is only really about 6 or 7 files. And the rest is implemented through API extensions, and there's around 60 of those. So they've kind of been added slowly over time. It's kind of grown, but the core itself is actually quite small, though I assume most deployments use quite a few of the extensions. So what are the kind of issues we've had with the v2 API? People using incorrect return codes for requests. There have been inconsistencies between the XML and JSON in terms of the way that the data is formatted when it's returned, even the parameter names. For some reason, when someone was writing the extension, the XML ones are different from the JSON ones. Following REST principles properly, things such as puts must be idempotent, that wasn't always done, that kind of thing. Lack of flexibility in managing extensions. The v2 extension framework was basically a custom job of loading modules, and so where the modules extension plugins had to live was fairly restrictive, and the naming was also fairly restrictive, so we couldn't comply to our own coding standards, because the class names had to match the file names, for example, for the loader to work. And then there was consistency between extensions. For example, this was the name of the extension. Sometimes they're called things like OS dash with all capitals and removing vowels. And then other times people would kind of spell it out properly. So we've kind of got rid of all the all caps and saving on letters and gone for instead that's been for the V3 API, it's OS scheduler hints, so people actually understand what the extension does from the name. V2 extensions, they've got no version number. There was kind of a latest updated date field in the extension, but no one was really sure what and how we could use that. The problem with that is that it made it very difficult to make even backwards compatible changes to extensions, because a client wouldn't know whether the extension which was loaded for their deployment had that feature or not. So what would happen is that someone would then, if they wanted to make a backwards compatible change, would create a new extension, and often that new extension did nothing except was present, so a client could look for that extension, and if it was, then the other extension would have the feature that they were looking for. So you kind of look through the files, you go, this extension does nothing, and then you have to search through other extensions to see who was looking for it. So it's getting very gross. Extensions, they modify core code. So they weren't really independent extensions. When I first had a look through service.py, which is part of the core, part of the Nova API, you kind of find this kind of instances, quite a few of these, where it's looking for OS config drive to manage creation of a server. So it's looking for an extension to exist, actually doing extension-specific work that should have been put into a different, which should have been in the extension itself rather than in the core code, which meant that the core itself was less stable because extensions had to modify it to do certain operations. So we wanted to clean this all up for the V3 API framework, and we started looking at entry points, and kind of through the late Grizzly stage, we had a look at a few options to see what was out there to clean this all up. Entry points looked really good. Doug Hellman did some of this work for Solometer, which is currently incubated, should be a full project in the Havana release. And he developed a Python package called Stevedore, which really simplifies simplifies the use of entry points to make it much easier for the common case of how we want to use plugins. I've got another slide on Stevedore, which I'll talk about in a second. In the V3 framework, everything is an extension, even the core code. This makes things a lot simpler for people writing extensions and for providing infrastructure for extensions, in that there's no special casing now for core API code versus extension code. So you don't get stuck in the problem with, I have to have this as a core part of the Nova API because I need this feature. Basically, an extension can do anything a core part of the API can do. Using Stevedore, you can have extension points in extensions, so you can build extensions on extensions, which you may need to in some cases. And there's examples of where now, for example, creating servers is an extension, and that allows other extensions to build upon that. In terms of installing extensions, they can live anywhere in Python path now because they're implemented through entry points. So you can have packages which contain just an extension, you can install it that way. You can blacklist and whitelist API extensions, which means you can say, I don't want this list of certain extensions ever to get loaded, and here's a whitelist. You say, only if it's in this whitelist will you load them. And in this case, a blacklist overrides the whitelist. That just helps deployers have a bit of stability with their deployment. So even if someone happens to install another extension, they're going to have to modify a config file before it kind of magically starts changing the behavior. And we've added versioning now too, to try and avoid some of the previous problems. This is a bit of an example of just using Stevedore and how much easier it's made things. You can see the top part is loading basically an extension. It's just a matter of saying what group name for the entry point you're using. You can supply a function which does some checking on the extension to see whether you want to load it or not. So that may be a blacklist check, whitelist check, to make sure that the object you're loading looks like an extension. You can pass parameters to it. And then to operate on the extension to, for example, to look for what resources and what controllers to load. It's as simple as doing this extension manager.map, and it just basically operates on all the extensions which are loaded. It's really cleaned the code up for us. And then in terms of the extension itself, it's just a matter of defining a bit of basic information such as the name of the extension, an alias for it, some namespace, a version, and then a couple of functions which define basically how to extend the WSGI, which we use for Nova. So in terms of porting from the V2 API to V3 API, I'm not sure how much of that is actually readable from back there. But for a very simple change from V2 to V3, when we're not fixing up anything, there's actually very few changes at all. We've done things like regularized names in terms of aliases. There's multi-nick over there. We've kind of standardized on OS for extensions -multi-nick. Got rid of, as I mentioned before, about scheduler hints, regularizing names, and putting a version number for our policy files. Policy files basically regulate who can access various interfaces. So between V2 and V3, you'll be able to have different security policies between the two. We also now have a proper base class for all extensions. Before, you could use the proper base class if you wanted to, but it wasn't enforced. We decided to enforce this for V3, just to try to make all extensions look the same. One of the issues we had with the V2 is that I think a lot of people came in writing an extension not knowing a lot about how to write extensions, and they cut and paste other people's extensions. So you kind of got this growth where they slowly diverged, and what an extension looked like depended on which one you kind of based your extension on. And they all ended up looking quite different, with different ones having different errors or redundancies in them. You can see we basically just need to change the namespace, the version number, and we implement the base class using an abstract base class, which forces people to use it all the time. Yeah.
How do you have an extension support 2 and 3?
Okay, so to go to 2 to 3, it's a huge copy and paste job. We didn't want to go through the pain of trying to have an extension support both. The main reason is that we want to change a lot of the actual format of the output which is returned between the two, and trying to maintain that in one file would get very messy. Yep. So
when do you think people will be able to delete V2 support from production, like HP Cloud Services? When can we turn off V2 support?
Right. So the idea is that Havana will release with basically a superset of what is in Grizzly, with the exception where we're deliberately not porting to V3, and I'll go through that in a bit of future. I'm hoping that in Icehouse we can remove V2 from the code base. That may be a bit premature, but we'll have to keep it for at least Havana.
Will that break all the clients?
Yes. So that's why I want to give them at least one cycle to port clients to V3. Yeah, that was the principal reason we couldn't just fix these in V2, was all the clients out there using the broken interfaces. We needed to start afresh. Okay, so this is, again, just an example of the small minimal number of files we had to do for a V2 to V3 port. Basically, you need to change the policy files, you cut and paste the extension from V2 to V3, make those modifications, update some test files, and just in setup.config, this is just for the entry point and then, to describe the extension which needs to be loaded. So the kind of things we're fixing in the V3 API, I went through these ones before, I guess just down below, bottom, there's no more core modifications by extensions. So if you write an extension, there's no need to do anything but add a new file rather than modify existing OpenStack API code. Other things we're looking at is better handling of methods which don't exist, returning 405s explicitly, and I think there's like allowed headers which goes back, which actually describes what methods you can use. There were a few cases where actions were used instead of methods, just because I think people were a bit inexperienced with REST APIs. Consistent naming sometimes would use kind of camel case, sometimes sometimes underscores, and we've made those consistent between extensions. You can now, through policy, describe whether or not certain extensions are visible to users or not. That doesn't actually make the APIs disappear themselves, but at least from the discovery point it does. And in the V2 URLs, we always had the project or tenant ID in the URL. That's kind of implied anyway through the authentication token which you get from Keystone. And so to simplify things, that's been removed, and in V3 you no longer need to supply that. One of the other issues we had with the V2 API is the handling of exceptions. A lot of the exception handling was implicit, kind of exceptions bubbled up through from the Nova code, and then in WSSGI, if they weren't caught, it tried to do a best case handling of the exception, convert it to what it thought was the right HTTP status code, and convert it. It would actually log a backtrace as well, which is pretty bad, and then return the code. So in V3, we're actually requiring extensions to explicitly specify what status codes they expect to come out of their methods, and it converts it to internal server errors if they don't. So hopefully that will help us better pick up earlier in the stage where programmers have not thought about properly what errors may propagate up, and we can address those sooner. Yep.
Do you have templates looking for ISEs then?
We don't yet. There is actually a Tempest blueprint to remove those issues. Every few months I go through and grep through Tempest logs to see for backtraces, and submit patches for those. But that is something that we would like to get into the gate eventually. So you just specify the status code in there, and the decorator looks after checking and handling of that. Other things we're fixing in the V3 API, there are things which are in core, which on reflection, there's consensus that we don't need in core, and then there's other things which over time, which didn't make it into core, but we couldn't really change core in the V2 API because, again, clients are dependent on it, which we're promoting to it. So if you're a user of these REST APIs and these are something which you disagree with, you really need to tell us kind of in the next 2 to 3 weeks so we can fix this before the Havana release, otherwise it'll change. And then there's quite a number of things which we're not porting to the V3 API. This is a list of extensions which we're not porting. They come under a few different classifications. The bare metal nodes is because Ironic's moving out anyway. There's things like the Cloud Pipe update. That's an example of where you can get the same functionality, or should be able to pretty soon, out of, what's it called now? Project formerly known as Neutron, sorry, yeah. Neutron, volumes.py is something which you can access all that functionality, except for a small part, through Cinder anyway. And part of this is because they used to be part of Nova, they've been broken out now. You no longer need to, and all Nova does now is proxy. It just, you make a request to Nova and it goes to Cinder or to Neutron anyway. So there's no need for Nova to be in the middle in these cases. There's a lot of networking stuff in there which is being removed as a result of that. So that'll clean quite a lot of stuff up. There's even a few extensions in there which do nothing at all. They're just in there for historical reasons, and had to actually hunt through the Git logs to work out why we have that at all, and it's just redundant. So in terms of current progress, how we're working for the Havana 1 date, 30th of May, we got most of the infrastructure and core merged. And it turned out that although the changes themselves weren't very large, the reviews took a very long time to get through, and they were quite difficult. The reason for that is because of the cut and paste, the change sets looked really big. Service.py, for example, is like 1,500 lines of code, and getting someone to review that can be quite difficult. And also, although problems existed in the V2 versions, when people looked at the code again, a whole lot of other issues were popping up, and we'd had to do lots and lots of revisions over code, which was basically code we didn't want to change too much because we're just doing porting work. So for the rest of the extensions, that only covered about 6 extensions, we realised that there was going to be a review issue. So for the rest of the extensions, we got into a different technique of submitting change sets, and that is to provide 2 change sets for every extension that we port. The first one is just to cut and paste the code from the V2 directory to the V3 directory, and basically get reviewers to rubber stamp that it makes no change at all. The code doesn't get imported by either the V2 or V3 extension framework, and the tests run against the V2 code anyway. We then submit a second change set which modifies that V3 version, and that means when it goes through the Git review process, all you do is you see a diff from V2 to V3, which is very small and easy to review. So we've got about somewhere around 60 to 70 extensions to port. We've got a couple of weeks, 2.5 weeks left before Havana 2 closes. All of them have been ported and they're in the review queue. About half of them, 30, have been merged, and we've got 40 or so left to work through various fixes and reviews. And that method of doing a copy and commit and then modify has worked a whole lot better this cycle. It's unfortunate that Git doesn't have kind of a git copy command which allows you to keep change history between that kind of mechanism. For Havana 3, we'll basically be polishing off the rest of the extensions which we haven't done. There's various fixes we need to do, but focus will be on integration testing and Tempest. There's a lot of extensions in the V2 API which, although they have unit tests, have no integration tests. And we need to add integration tests to get a higher, reliability on those APIs, and so we know when they change as well. And of course, documentation. So we're going to have to produce a lot of documentation for that. We're still to kind of work out how that's going to work, whether we'll be doing it the same way as we produce documentation for the V2 API, or if there's a better way of doing that. So how can you help if you want to help? If you've used the V2 REST API and there's things that you don't like in it, please let us know. Submit a bug report, send an email to the mailing list, or send it direct to me if you really want to. Just let us know somehow, because the window on being able to fix things up which are not backwards compatible is kind of closing. Once we release Havana, we can't fix it up until we do a V4 API. So definitely, if there's things you don't like, please let us know. Writing Tempest tests, there's a huge amount of test gap coverage, which we've got at the moment. So if you like writing tests, then please donate tests, and that would be really, really helpful. And the last is just to use it. If you use DevStack at all, the V3 API is enabled by default. Currently with the Nova, if you just do a normal checkout of master, it's disabled, but there's an OS API V3 flag, which you just set it to true and it will enable the interface. And that's about all I've got. Are there any questions? Nope. Okay, we've got lots of spare time. Anyone want to give another talk?
Really? No questions for Tim? Not even you, Russell? Yes, we got one.
Sure. Yeah.
So I might have missed this or just misunderstood it, but how are you maintaining compatibility with version 2 once you've copied it into the version 3 and made those changes?
So the V2 code base is staying the same and completely separate. And we just create a new v3 API, which you can run in parallel. You can disable, I don't think you can actually disable v2 yet, but we're going to have to add a flag. Oh, bug fixes, it's a real pain at the moment. You need to apply it to both. And for the next release, we're going to have to just make sure that when anyone fixes a v2 bug, we fix a v3. That's actually been an issue throughout the development cycle. As we've put these ports in, we've had bug fixes come into the v2 while we've been trying to get the v3 version committed, and we've had to do it manually. I think once everything's landed in terms of extensions, we'll just tell all the reviewers that if you see anything modified for v2, make sure they make a change to v3 as well, and we'll catch it there. Yeah.
So with that experience, that nightmare behind you, would you do it the same way again? Or would you do the work to have a single source and migrate and blah?
My feeling is still that a single source would be much, much more painful, because you'd have to... The changes that we'd have to make in terms of extension names changing, the format of how we return data, we'd have a whole lot of if-else statements scattered throughout the code. And then when we want to throw away the v2 API, that's going to be another huge job. Whereas currently, when we throw away v2, we'll just remove a directory and everything will be gone, and that'll be much cleaner. The one regret I do have is for the setup.config, because each extension needs to add just a single line to that file. We've got a huge number of merge conflicts. We've submitted 60 extensions at one time, a few of them pop in and everything starts merge conflicting just on that one file. In retrospect, I should have said, don't add that entry, we'll worry about that later, and just add it at once, and everything would have flowed in much easier.
Is that file sorted?
Yeah, it didn't start out sorted, we were putting on the end, and I thought, this is really stupid. We'll do it alphabetically, and then it's got a bit easier, but we still get lots of, as it gets bigger, it gets easier kind of thing. Yeah.
With the XML support, have you considered just doing an XML shim that exists at a different entry point, rather than using content?
Yeah, that's kind of been looked at. There is kind of default XML serializer, deserializer that's often used, and then there's some cases where that doesn't quite work and so you need to special case it. There's talk of moving to PCAN WSME instead of WSGI, and I've been told that does it all automatically for us, so we won't need to worry about it. But we tried to squeeze that move from WSGI and to PCAN in this kind of Havana development cycle, but it just wouldn't fit. And this is the kind of thing that we need to do all within one release, otherwise it's a bit worthless. So eventually there'll be a V4 release, and we'll move to PCAN WSME, and that should clean up some of the issues for us.
I guess I can ask a question. With the double maintenance problem with V2 and V3 API needing updated, have you thought about making any changes to the continuous integration infrastructure to make that easier?
To pick up issues or to...
So, for example, make a tag API impact for commit messages. So if you see someone changing a /v2 file and there isn't a /v3 file changed, then...
Yeah, that's interesting. We could perhaps have something in the gate which looks for a change to certain files, because we can just look in a directory. If anyone changes anything in there, there must be a change in v3. I'll have to have a talk to the infrastructure guys to see whether we can do that, because it's a bit hard to keep up with all the reviews flowing through. I tried to keep an eye out for them, but an automated system would be much better. Yeah.
So you mentioned at the start that some of the issues that you were trying to fix were things like puts not being idempotent or things like that. So while you may have gone through and fixed all the bugs yourself in V3, is there anything that you've done to stop this from occurring?
Not really. We're going to have to rely on much better reviews going through. One thing as part of the documentation which we want to do is to write some really good documentation on how to write an extension for Nova. Most of the people I've spoken to who have written extension have said, and like me, just went in there and thought, I'll just get an existing extension and look at what they do and cut and paste it. And the problem with that all it has done is propagate bad habits or misunderstandings. But getting better reviews in the process would definitely help. Yep.
It begs the question for me about change management in OpenStack in general, and have there been discussions at a higher level, higher order of abstraction about this kind of issue in the wider context of OpenStack in general?
Are you familiar with how the change management works in OpenStack?
Only vaguely. I think
Okay.
it wouldn't hurt to perhaps go through that.
I really like the Gerrit system. Basically, the changes, you make the changes in Git, you do a Git review, it pushes up, you can see it on a website. I don't know whether I might be able to show it to you. Oh, you have a session about this afterwards? Okay.
Michael's slides for getting started on OpenStack development.
Okay, yeah, I'll leave that to then. But it's a really nice process. No. That's fine.
So for those who didn't hear Robert's comments, there's actually going to be a walkthrough of the change management in OpenStack in the introduction to OpenStack development later today.
Yeah. And basically, anyone can review changes on the website, but only core developers can approve it, and you need 2 cores to approve it. I think as we get more experience in writing REST APIs and API extensions, we'll get better reviews out of it. I think a lot of the problems, although it's called V2, V1 from what I can tell was really, really small. So V2 was really V1, and there was a lot of inexperience there in how to write APIs and what they should look like. These days I'm seeing of the stuff even we're putting in, we're getting really good reviews on kind of, no, that's not the right way to do it in a REST format, you should be doing it like this. So I think with more experience, it'll end up being better this time around. Sure.
Maybe this is something else that you'll discuss in the session later, but how do you enforce API compatibility? Are there just lots of tests, or do you have a spec that you validate somehow?
So we have, when you submit a change to OpenStack, really any change, not just API ones, you're expected to submit a unit test as well for the behaviour which you've added. So that's the first check. The second one is the integration test through Tempest, and that actually starts up a proper cloud and starts running tests against the cloud itself. And that's why I want better coverage through Tempest, and that has picked up issues where people have gone, that return code's wrong, I think we should just fix it, and they try and put a change through, and then it fails the Tempest tests, and we go, no, you can't change that, because the API, you can't change the API like that.
So that's all just ad hoc testing? Like there's not some kind of structural thing that traverses the API or anything like that?
There's no automated generation of tests at all. It relies on people writing tests for it.
So I think potentially related to one of the earlier questions, not so much the code level review processes, but the higher level governance things of like saying, okay, we need to do a new backwards incompatible version of this API, deciding when is it okay to drop the old version of the API. Because as OpenStack grows, there's just going to be a heck of a lot of stuff depending on these APIs. And so Linux has its API stability guarantees, ABI stability guarantees, and just how does that higher level work?
My understanding is that for these APIs, we need to keep them for at least one release cycle. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes for longer than that. So that's why I'm saying, Havana will have V2 and V3. So at the very earliest, it'll be Icehouse before we can deprecate. But that'll be a decision which will have to be made at a higher technical level, discussions on the mailing list. I assume the technical board will have a look at that as well. Did you want to?
Yeah, so just to add in there, there's kind of a maturity thing. So at the moment, if you look at Ubuntu does release every 6 months. and you can go from release to release. If you look at Fedora, I think it's 6 months as well, and long-term supported releases that run for years. So there's a problem with OpenStack. OpenStack also does 6 months compatibility from release to release. You can't skip a release of OpenStack when you upgrade. So if you were running F and you want to get to H, you have to install G and run all of the migration scripts, whatever they look like, for G before you can install H. And this makes it tricky for people who are looking at, a 5-year support cycle, because they have to guarantee that no customer ever stays on the same version for a year, because that would mean they were trying to skip. So there's a disconnect between one of the distribution communities that surrounds OpenStack, the Linux vendors specifically, and OpenStack's own model about how you evolve and grow these APIs. And I think that's coming to a head. I think it's going to hit some fairly, shall we say, vibrant discussions in Hong Kong, and I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I mean, my perspective, I used to be at a Linux vendor, and now I'm not, and I'm like, let's stop doing releases, let's just push everything, run trunk, make trunk stable, make everyone happy with it, and gracefully clean up the code as we go. But that's actually quite a hard sell, so it's going to be interesting. I think Tim wanted to add some stuff there.
Speaking as somebody who produces an enterprise Linux distro which has multi-years of support and service packs that happen occasionally, lining up a 6-month upstream release cycle with like a year-long development cycle and 18 months of support and then more support for customers with more money, and it's interesting.
So Tim, how are you going to be handling that with, Havana coming out? You're based on Grizzly, and then...
That's a really good question. We've got an Essex release out, the SUSE Cloud 1 product at the moment, which is the one that we support on SLES, is Essex. And the next one that's coming out, I'm not sure if it got officially announced which OpenStack we're using, but anyway, a good one. It'll be a good one. And I believe from that good one, there'll be a nice ability to upgrade to an even better one later. I'm just a little bit uncertain exactly what the step is between the current one and the next good one that's happening. So,
Are you having sort of backfill migrations and so on to cover the gap between what upstream does?
do we have to backfill migrations? I don't know, actually. Sorry.
I can just agree it's going to come to a head. we know what our customers are like. We go, your guys' model is really, really good. They're about 10 years behind that mindset. And they have the money. We should talk offline. Yeah.
All the more reason to come to Hong Kong, I guess. Any further questions? No further questions specifically for Chris, but we do have about 15 minutes before lunch, so we can, if the audience permits it, open up to more broader questions about OpenStack and just kind of do a bit more impromptu Q&A. Does that sound interesting? Yes? Cool. Are our technical experts ready to get hammered with random questions about everything to do with OpenStack? Blank looks. Who's first?
So mine's not as much a generic question as a question about the previous talk. You were talking about when you do testing the migration step between the previous version and the next version. Is that the previous version of Trunk or the previous 6-month release, or both? Or
So the current focus of TripleO is deploying Trunk and only Trunk, and that's because of this. When you get into releases, you start looking at how do you move between releases, and it actually it's not just a little bit more complex, it's quite a bit more complex. But I think our scope is going to grow because there's enough people interested in how we're deploying but who don't want to deploy Trunk that we either need to cut them off and say, go do it somewhere else, or yes, come play in our sandpit and work with them. So what I meant was, you have some version of code out there and you have a new version of code out there, and there may or may not be database migrations, there may or may not be data file or schema migrations, or just configuration migrations to turn on. Like, imagine you've got a versioned API on your Rabbit bus and you're sending messages with a version, I don't know, 150 or something, and now the new code base is going to send them with 152. Is that going to play well? Is the orchestration of the upgrade going to upgrade nodes in the right order, such that the messages are only received by things that can handle them, or if you're expecting messages to be received that can't be handled, will the code downgrade properly and gracefully, and that kind of thing. So it's not about 6-month gaps, it's about one commit gaps. So I guess there's a thing I skipped, which is that there's a risk assessment, right? What is the risk of applying a 5-line code change to a project? Okay. Is it half the risk of applying a 10-line code change? Okay, Tim just said the 2-character change broke his whole file system once, and that the risk is higher when it's small because you get cavalier. And I think, there's some merit there, but I think at the other end, it's probably a U curve, right? So there's a sweet spot somewhere where the risk per change is the lowest per lines of code changed, but it's not linear. It's not twice the risk when you get double the number of lines of code. It's more than twice the risk, because you have the risk of the 2 separate changes interacting, and you don't know that either of them is correct yet because you're not actually running them in production. So the reason we want to run trunk isn't to run trunk and then bring in thousands of lines of code in each deploy. We want to run trunk and minimize the delta, try and find that sweet spot, keep on top of it, and then kind of surf along and have a low risk of change and quick rollbacks. And that's kind of incompatible with, again, it's another reason not to do 6-monthly or yearly code drops. And that's why I think we need to have lots of discussions about that.
It's basically... So the reason the web development world has moved, a lot of the biggest web properties are doing continuous deployment, is because they have the test infrastructure in place to support it. And it means that, yes, occasionally you will push a mistake live, but you can also really trivially push the fix live. And so your mean time to fix is really, really fast as well.
Time to detect and time to fix.
Yeah, time to detect something's gone wrong, and time to fix it are wonderful. But to actually do that, you need amazing metrics, excellent automated testing, and excellent deployment. We've done that at the software as a service layer. It's not a solved problem, but there are solutions out there, and they work pretty well, and a lot of the big web properties use them. Doing that at the infrastructure layer would be an amazing achievement, and that's what this is aimed at, and it does completely change the way you approach your infrastructure. But it'll be a nice place to get to, but we're not there yet.
Okay, I can start seeing some people getting a little bit restless now. Do we want to keep going for some more questions, or do we want to break 10 minutes early for lunch? Okay, that's dead neutral. Probably a vote for lunch. So we can continue this in the afternoon, and feel free to grab everyone at lunch, including our sponsor Aptera. Thanks to them again.